So I'll invite our panelists to take seats and welcome questions or suggestions or comments from the audience. And maybe I'll just start out with one for Mark while people are collecting their thoughts. Mark, you mentioned joint management. So when you're doing a trial with the industry, footing the entire bill, many oncologists in this room would say they don't want the company meddling once the thing's set. How does joint management work in the types of trials you do?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I think it's something that each interaction winds up being unique for that. As you point out, it is their drug and their money, and so they are well positioned to use contract research organizations to do the trial, but they come to us for our expertise. And so we wind up having very frank conversations at the beginning of any potential marriage to set the boundaries and say there needs to be a respect for the area of expertise that each group will have and to trust them for that. And for us, it's how to pull off large-scale clinical trials because we've done that more than any of their teams have ever done that. And so it winds up being throughout, and our trials could last 2, 3, 4, 5 years, a series of conversations for our team, typically managing the calls and disseminating a constant message to both people within the company, and if they bring on a third party, some contract research organization that might be doing monitoring or what have you, that still we wind up running that. And it's everything from the large to the small. It's debating about the protocol design for it, the endpoints, the statistical analysis plan, to every field in the case report form, and thinking, this won't fly for a site. They're not going to answer it the right way, and this will ultimately be a useless field for us. So that that's the collaboration that we have. They could do it on their own, but they come to us, and the way we work together is we're sort of guaranteed that partnership throughout, and it's a dialogue for the half a decade that we work together.
Great. Mike, can you, the microphone over there, and there are people, about 100 people, I think, listening in on this, so as you ask questions, give your name and use the microphone, please.
Great. Mike Caligari from The Ohio State University. Mark, just quickly, do you collect tissue in some or all of these studies, and who owns that tissue for subsequent studies?
So it's a good question. We collect biosamples, which for us would be plasma and serum and DNA. I'm sure the samples may actually sort of ultimately still be owned by the patients, but who manages them is we typically split the aliquot. It actually depends a bit. Some companies have a greater interest in biosamples than others, but we typically wind up splitting the aliquot so they can do whatever they want with it, and we do what we want with our aliquot. So the DNA, so we get whole blood samples and then extract DNA from it.
Dan Macy's University of Washington, and another question for Mark to follow up on your sentence that ended with the term case report form. I was surprised in the cores that you described for TIMI, there was nothing that was data management infrastructure other than what would have been a perfect 1985 paper-based world of case report forms sent out and pieces of paper flying back and forth from tens of thousands of sites worldwide. Could you comment on the opportunities for advanced, secure electronic movement of data, especially in international arenas, would seem to be spectacular, especially when you have these large numbers that, if you're doing things inefficiently, make very, very large multipliers of inefficiency worldwide.
Oh, sure. So maybe I wasn't clear. So our case report forms are all electronic. I've sort of dropped the E prefix before them because it's become our standard. So all of them are electronic now, if that answers your question.
Well, electronic in what sense? Are they just printable PDFs that become paper at the sites, or do you do secure data management real-time to all your sites worldwide?
Yeah, so there's a through either Inform or Rave or the typical example. So it's online, web-based ways to access a database that sites can access and we can access. And there's actually a variety. I mean, you've actually touched on a really critical issue. There's a variety of ways to do it. One model is the the fairly standard approach with a case report form that investigators will have a patient encounter, a one-year visit, gather some data, and eventually type it in through a computer with internet access onto a central server. And then that is cleaned and goes into the database. There are approaches now where you actually get rid of these sort of shadow documents and you just enter straight into the laptop in real time. And there are ways, in fact, to make sure people are compliant because you time how long the visit is. And if it's too short, it means that they're reading off a thing and not actually interviewing a patient. So there's a notion of having the real-time data entry with the patient. That is a little more avant-garde. Most of the approaches are just an electronic case report form that people enter through online access.
Thank you.
Over on this side.
My name's Nancy Roach, and I'm a patient advocate from Fight Colorectal Cancer. And I have a question for Joe. Historically, or one of the truisms I've always heard is that the cooperative groups exist to do research for rare cancers, because that's a place where pharma doesn't want to do it because the market size is so small. But the data that you showed pointed out that actually companies are doing an awful lot in rare cancers. Is that accurate?
Yes, I think that is. They certainly are doing lots in rare cancers. Where they haven't done a lot is in neglected diseases, and we've seen a lot of public-private partnerships develop and evolve to take care of that unmet need. But cancer drug development in industry is very substantial, and it's they tend to investigate lots of indications in the oncology area. Tend to do so more than in other areas. Lots of those individual indications are, small enough in prevalence that they would, qualify for as orphan drug designations. Because they're hoping to get approvals across a number of indications, which would obviously dramatically increase the market size for the molecule.
I think if I could just add that what I didn't really cover in my talk is that many of these venture philanthropy groups are starting to not just partner with industry, they're funding industry. So the CF Foundation that I referenced at the end recently signed a deal with Pfizer where they're paying Pfizer to stay in this space or to get into CF. You have other examples of that are both oncology and non-oncology. So I think this small market size issue, obviously the pharmaceutical industry is grappling with. I think, and again, another topic I didn't want to wade too heavily into, the next frontier, so to speak, is the reimbursement issues and the pricing issues. So you see drugs coming out that are priced at $200,000, $300,000 a year. Depending on the longevity of that patient population, we could be looking at, a lifespan, a long lifespan being on that kind of drug. So I think the reimbursement system is starting to have a little bit of sticker shock. And I know from the patient advocacy perspective, there are a number of groups that are starting to look into this to figure out what is going to be the recipe that they can bring together the payers, CMS, and the other parties that be, because it's not going to be sustainable in the period of time where we're seeing just general healthcare costs going up. And then I think the other kind of force that has to be reckoned with is chronic diseases in the United States, obesity epidemic. The amount of money that those issues are going to be taking away from reimbursement of these types of drugs is also a factor.
Patty?
Patty Gans, UCLA. I had a question for Mark Sabatine. Actually, it's three parts. It's really the operational organizations. How do you deal with monitoring and auditing for each trial? Is it done by the pharmaceutical company, or do you do your monitoring and auditing? The second thing is, you're going from different pharmaceutical agents organization to others. Is there a standard form, case report form, that you're able to operationalize across all your TIMI trials, or do you have to do a one-off with each organization? And the third thing is, how do you fund your infrastructure in between trials? I mean, obviously, you may have a foundation or something else that helps you keep going, but you're really dependent on getting that next trial in, and how do you do that? So that's really the three-part operational management of your infrastructure?
Yep. Okay. So hopefully I remember all three. So the first question for monitoring. So we don't do monitoring. So some things we don't do. We don't do monitoring. I think there are other groups that do that. Either the company itself typically has their in-house monitors, or there are contract research organizations that do it, and our desire to sort of support that staff is not something that we'd want to do. That being said, we train the monitors. So we train them on the disease state before the trial begins. We train them on the protocol, and throughout the trial, we have meetings where we review issues for the protocol. So we sort of take charge of them, but they're not on our payroll. Secondly, in terms of the case report form, sadly it differs from each sponsor where, and it's even fascinating within the company, and I think this illustrates the tensions, if you will, that for a company, they will say, we have a standard case report form. Here's how we like to collect concomitant medications. And this form works great across all our trials, our phase 1, our phase 2, and our phase 3. And the truth is it works okay, but it should be tailored completely differently for a phase 3. And some real world examples, but in one trial, statin use was of particular interest. There was a dedicated page for it, and yet route of administration was the standard thing that had every possible route. And the notion that you're going to ask a research coordinator to scroll through intrathecal on the way to oral for a statin when the only way they can be given is orally is, I think, kind of insulting to the RCs. But there's tension. To reprogram that page is time and money. And so that's the sort of the perspective that we offer, that in a 25,000 patient trial, you've got to make it easy for the sites. We have fields that we like, that we know have worked over the years, and so we try to bring that to each trial. As we have worked with companies again and again, as long as the same people are still there, we say, remember what we did for TIMI 48? That worked great. Let's just do that again. And then the third part is, our funding, the trials themselves are funded through industry. We then have a series of NIH grants for ancillary studies, biosamples, et cetera. But that's my job, to keep the trials coming.
But you have no other, do you have a foundation, or how do you, you're obviously out there negotiating the next contract to keep going. I mean, how does that prevent you from being compromised to do trials that may not be the best science?
Yeah, no, so I mean, we're fortunately in the position that we turn away business, but you're right, that could put us in a position where we might not. And so that's why we've tried to stay relatively lean for that, so we can be quite selective.
Chuck Blanky from SWOG. I have a question for Mark as well. So I was really intrigued to hear that some of the cardiology clinical researchers are giving up to 80% of their time for their research. And I think we have a very different model in oncology, and we tend to think that seeing patients feeds our accrual. A lot of people in this room, Dr. Sledge, Dr. Shilsky, are really true experts in clinical management, take dozens of advice calls every week. So the question is, for the cooperative group chairs who need more time out of their volunteers, do we accept that the diseases are different, cancer is more complicated, and we need the clinical experience? But if that's not the case, how do we convince our chairs to let the RVUs go and let us devote more time to research?
Right. Well, so let me make an important distinction. So what I meant in that slide was that those people in my group, in the TIMI study group, who are the global PIs for the trials, they're 75, 80% research. I did not mean to imply that of the individual sites, that any investigator at a site is 75 to 80. In fact, I think it's quite the contrary, that research for them will still be a minor. Their major will still be clinical. And that sort of makes sense, that if their primary function is to get patients in the trial, you want them to have a broad clinical practice. And I think for, at least in the cardiology arena, it winds up being a nice mix for individuals who don't want to run their own lab, but still be involved in research and potentially offer their patients cutting edge therapy. I mean, exactly the role model that you guys have done so beautifully in oncology, that it gives them an additional sort of spectrum of what they do for their career, but it's certainly not their major for most people.
Just to follow that up, who pays their salaries then, the 80%ers? Are the salaries for these people paid from the income from the industrial contracts?
Yeah. So I have in the TIMI study group, there are 12 faculty in my group, and 75 to 80% of their salary comes from TIMI, from the work they do there, and the other 20 to 25 is from clinical time at Brigham and Women's.
Okay.
Dr. Sabatine, that I can see some parallels that are of interest.
Tell us who you are, please.
Oh, excuse me. My name is Nancy Morton. I've had about 25 years experience in the CCOP program. I live in Colorado now, and we have a CCOP, large 17 institution CCOP in Colorado, which is not institution-based. It's over 125 cancer specialists. So what interests me about your program is that you have participating physicians all over the world. And I assume that you have in some way established relationships with them that engage them in continuing to work with you. I'm assuming that their institutions don't tell them that they have to do it, but more commonly, they have professional reasons and perhaps some monetary. And I'm wondering how you keep those individual physicians engaged and manage things on a grassroots level, which is really the challenge with the CCOP program.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, because we do have a large Rolodex, to use an anachronistic term, of sites available, the sites don't belong to us. There's no pledge of allegiance to TIMI, but they do tend to work with us frequently. And that's because we spend a lot of time trying to design a trial that, one, we think the science is high quality, and that gets back to the notion of the benefit of getting to be very selective for the trials we decide to do, but it's also the time we put into it. So for each of our trials, again, there is a TIMI investigator who's spending 75 or 80% of his or her time on the trial, meaning if there's a question from the site, they can call and they get a physician at TIMI to whom they would be speaking, not a monitor or someone else who may be skilled in the protocol, but we believe in the primacy of the physician-to-physician interaction. So for every element we do, and it's a beautiful pairing, every communication that goes out is co-drafted by the PI and by the senior project director. If it was just the PI, it might be scientifically brilliant, and the project director would say, no one will understand what you wrote, and so this needs to be fixed, and let's make sure that people remember at the end of the day they got to do A, B, and C. And it's that pairing of the two. And so we do that at the US, where we try to do the most interesting trials and make it a good experience for the investigators. And I think the reward that at the end, two factors. One, that hopefully the trial is successful, and that brings the scientific reward for that. But two, even if it turns out the drug doesn't work for that the quality of the trial was great. Because for us with the long-term follow-up, that's a critical issue. So the percent off study drug is low. The percent withdrawal of consent is low. The loss to follow-up you can count on one hand. So that even if the trial is negative, we know it's truly negative or neutral, not that it was a poorly conducted trial and people can sort of stand tall at the end. So that's what we work to do. That's what we do in the US, and we have a series of what we call national lead investigators for each country who do the same, who are key cardiologists in France, in Germany, in Russia, et cetera. And they have their link to sites there, and they foster the same thing and act as our sort of eyes and ears and arms for us to have that direct bond that obviously is going to be hard for us globally, but we try to recreate that on a global scale.
Let me just tack a question on about motivation. Part of the motivation you've explained in terms of the quality. Another part of motivation is being paid adequately.
Mm-hmm.
Do these companies pay full freight of the costs on these many, many sites so that a person who decides to put in the time and effort and collect the data actually gets full reimbursement for the effort?
Yeah. So ultimately we obviously advocate for the highest, most reasonable patient, per patient, per subject payment to the sites. The sponsor ultimately determines, what that dollar value is, and that winds up being constant for all the sites because we simply couldn't, with, in the U.S., 350 sites devolve into a site-by-site, negotiation. But they come up with an amount, and if it feels right to the site, it's fine. If it's not a good match, it's not a good match.
And then they just pass it.
And they pass in
right.
for another opportunity.
I'm Turkan Gardner with Pragmatica Corporation. I'm a health statistician, interested in prospects for large accumulating databases. And I have a question for Dr. Sabatine relative to your biomarker code and genetic core that you mentioned, particularly with respect to confidentiality and informed consent. How long is the patient's informed consent good for? And does it pass on to future studies that in large databases?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So obviously all the patients give written informed consent. Each trial differs for the duration that their samples would be stored and the purposes for which they could be used. And when the time is up for that trial, then the samples are destroyed. And
Oh, they are
patients always
destroyed. Okay. yeah.
at the end of the time that was specified in the consent form, but usually we have it for quite a long period of time, and all that is in the consent form and sorted out the IRB at each site.
Are they, so there are no prospects that they could be used in a future trial? Was the patient approached again if he or she
No.
is eligible? Oh, I see.
No, so we'll use those samples to gain insights to look at circulating biomarkers, to look at genetic variants that may influence the efficacy of the drug or simply disease risk. But we don't know who they belong to, so it's totally anonymized from our perspective.
Right.
So we are not in a position, we're not able to look at those data and then say, let's contact Mr. Jones who lives at, 110 Mockingbird Lane. We don't have that ability.
Okay, thank you.
So I have a question for Joe. You mentioned the term efficiency as part of the things you look at, but I'm very curious, if you add up your 8+1, roughly 9 years for oncology drugs, what % of the time is spent where the delay is processing at the FDA versus the delay is due to the vagaries and the inefficiencies of getting the trial done? The FDA is often the whipping boy, but I suspect it's a very modest % of the time of that 9 years that it takes. Or do you have data that could address that?
Well, I don't have data that can address that for the clinical development period, but we have data that addresses that to some extent for the approval phase. In the study that I mentioned earlier on cycle times, you can look at the amount of time that the application is back with the sponsor versus with the FDA, and don't hold me to any exact percentages now, but I believe that the figure was in the neighborhood of 80% in terms of the drug being at the FDA, 80% of the total approval phase time on average versus 20% back with the sponsor responding to what the FDA requires.
Okay. Good. And if there's no other questions, I'll ask one more. In the oncology area, in the cooperative groups, there's a lot of discussion about bringing assistant professors in and as planning these research trials, which are done at a much smaller scale than what you're describing in Timmy, that there's a wonderful education process for young faculty. And on the other side of the coin, the number of names on the publication isn't a list of 130, it's a list of 20 or 10, and they get credit for it. And I'm curious, in the cardiology experience with Timmy, those two aspects, is most of the thinking done by those 12 people and the experts they bring in on a particular trial, and how is credit given out when people come up for promotion and things like that?
Yep, so that's also a great question, and obviously as the projects require larger and larger numbers of individuals, there's still in a line a beginning and an end, so that makes it challenging. So our approach is for the trial, for the leadership, there is the leadership within Timmy, which is typically a study chairman, principal investigator, and then a co-PI. And the co-PI is exactly what you say, is someone who's going to be at the assistant professor level. And they learn a lot from doing the trial. And then at the end, each trial, the mix is a little bit different, but usually it's some blend of they may either present the trial, they may first author the paper, they may be second author, but then there are key secondary analysis which are still targeted to New England Journal, JAMA, Lancet that they would first author. And then, eventually, as they get more senior in that role, there'll be sub-studies within the trial that they may eventually get a chance to senior author as we have research fellows coming through. So we try to make sure they get the spectrum of credit for that. And we have obviously large databases now from the 50 or some odd completed trials that then they can propose research projects that either a more senior person proposes and they lead it, or they can go get NIH funding to investigate something and senior author it and mentor a junior person. So, very cognizant of that and proud of the promotion process within the group of getting people up from instructor, which is a Harvard peculiarity, to assistant professor, to associate, and so on.
And most of these people are in the Brigham system, though.
So everyone at TIMI is part of the Brigham system now. Yep.
Okay. All right, last question. This is Suanna.
Thanks. Suanna Brunigi with the American Society of Clinical Oncology. Dr. Dorsha was talking earlier today about the time it takes to get agreements with companies around use of their drugs and some of the work that they've done with CRADAs and those sorts of things to streamline that process. And I'm wondering, I'd like to hear how you've dealt with those similar things within your system and how many different companies you're working with, and how you've handled those kinds of efficiencies or trying to get efficiencies there.
Yep. So I think there's a couple of levels. First and foremost, then is the science part, which winds up being a long courtship phase to think about what's the phase 2 data and do we think it's compelling for phase 3, and we go back and forth for that. In parallel, if we think the science is compelling enough that it makes sense for us to get involved, then it's operationally how we would work together. And for each sponsor, there's a different degree of collaboration depending on what resources they have in-house that they want to use and what are sort of their efficiencies. Luckily, we've worked with virtually every big pharma company, and so luckily now there's sort of a track record just in terms of the lawyers and the agreements for this language now works. We don't need to reinvent the wheel for this, and now it's just scope of work for this particular project. And we have very strict rules at Harvard in terms of getting the database and the ability to publish in academic freedom. For sponsors we haven't worked with, there's a back and forth as they come to understand that. For others that have worked with us, then it's much simpler. So, to answer your question, we work with virtually all big pharma, but as we work with them again and again, we don't need to always reinvent the wheel. But each interaction is its own unique beast, though, at the end of the day.
And you mentioned NIH, but are these negotiations that go on solely between Harvard and the companies, or is NIH involved in that, in those decisions at all?
Yeah, this is Brigham and the sponsor and the company. And then there might be NIH grants to query existing databases, but typically not for ongoing. Just the pace of trying to interdigitate the two winds up being difficult. We've done that a couple of times. But practically, it's sort of a hurry up and wait. And once the sponsor is ready to go to decide if there's funding for an ancillary study, you have to set the case report form, you have to set the biosample kits, and having them out of sync has been a challenge, unfortunately. Even with the NIH trying very hard to fast track approval of those grants, it's still challenging.
Okay, well, I want to thank the audience and our speakers. And we have 45 minutes for lunch, which is served outside. And for those of you that are new here, cell phones are often difficult to manage in this building. It seems to be bomb-proof, so if you step out on the street, some of you will find you'll get much better reception. Thank you.